All right, good morning, students. This lesson is all about analyzing how conservation biologists protect biodiversity. If you actually aren't aware of this, we're going to talk about this association today. But in our area, in the Little Neck area, there is a conservation effort that's going on right now called the Douglas Manor Environmental Association, and they are in the middle of restoring some wetland in the Little Neck area. So this is actually going on in our area right now. So let's talk a little bit about what they do and just in general what our conservation biologist does. So their goal is to develop strategies to help the loss of species. And they do that by protecting the species from harm, but also, probably the bigger thing, is protecting their habitats. So they look to understand the habitat, what are the threats to the habitat, and how can they either get rid of those threats or reduce the threats or prevent the threats from growing. And the first big one is changing laws. So if you know anything about what environmental laws were like even 50 years ago, 60 years ago, there weren't that many. If we go back to the 1940s and 50s, there were really not that many laws protecting the environment, protecting the soil, protecting the air, protecting the water. So changing laws, petitioning local, state, and the federal government to change the laws to protect the environment, that's a huge thing that conservationists will do. A good example of that is bald eagles. So bald eagles were, on the brink of extinction. And one thing that was done was laws were changed, and you can see how the number of bald eagles has just skyrocketed ever since. So even in the data, we can see how something like the Endangered Species Act, protecting endangered, identifying, and then going about ways to protect, to actually grow the species again, it actually does work. These efforts do have real impacts, and so you can see how with the enacting of the Endangered Species Act, you can see how bald eagles have since gone up tremendously. All right, so you have laws, but you have to enforce them. So the creation of the Department of Environmental Conservation, the creation of the Department of Environmental Protection, and real men and women that go out there and actually enforce the laws, that's a huge part of conservation. There are laws and people will still break them, especially if breaking the law just means they have to pay a fine. If it's a big enough company, they might be willing to just break the law anyway and pay the fine. So making sure the fines are high enough, making sure there's enough pressure on them to have them not break the laws, that's a big part of it too. All right, so here's a really interesting one. Wildlife corridors. So we talked about how in the last lesson, how roads, buildings can be a huge barrier for organisms to get from one place to another. And when roads and buildings and cities are built, that really disrupts habitats. It disrupts the movement of populations of organisms. So a wildlife corridor is basically a structure that's built over a road, and that allows the organisms to travel between habitats or travel to different places. You can see here this wildlife corridor for crabs. So the crabs are able to get where they breed, and then when they pop out of their the babies pop out and then they go back to the ocean or back again. That's a really important thing because there's a road here and they can't get through that road. If there wasn't anything there, they would just get crushed by moving cars, thousands of cars. It would really disrupt the population. So a wildlife corridor connects separated nature preserves together, or areas that have been set aside for, okay, we're not going to build on this, and we can now connect them. So, for instance, in Florida, you can see this gigantic piece of land here. That's, we have many nature preserves, and you can see how there's a corridor here that connects them all together, and that just preserves the habitats. It allows the organisms there to to proliferate and grow in size. If this wasn't here, that land would be gobbled up by people. People would buy the land for usually very cheap. In some cases, land can be very cheap to buy. A developer comes in, they build a mall, they build a housing complexes, they build apartment buildings. This allows for them to not do that, and they say, okay, no, we have to preserve the animals here, and and then they connect them together into a corridor. Now, this one is, again, this goes back to our local area, but this is done all over the place. Habitat restoration projects. People go in, engineers go in, professionals, they seek to understand the problem. How has the habitat, degraded over time, and how can we go about bringing it back to its normal state? So a habitat restoration project. And the DMEA, the Douglas Manor Environmental Association, they are in the middle of actually doing this. So they restore the habitat and they seek to bring it back to its original condition, no matter how long ago that was. It could be 100 years ago, and they're going to bring it back to how it was. So this is a real wetland preservation. This is we're actually standing here on Memorial Field, actually, and this is the former Senator Avella. He was giving a really big check to DMEA to actually go ahead and fund the restoration of this area. So this is the actual restoration site. It's pretty tiny, but a small effort can have a huge impact on the area. So Memorial Field, and the restoration site is right next to it. I haven't kept up with it, but so I'm actually not even sure where they are in the process of restoring it, but I know it's a very long-term project. It could take 5 to 10 years to happen. Restoration projects are very, very slow. They are very, very slow. All right, so other restoration efforts, you can take captive populations, so you start breeding organisms in captivity, and you then bring them up, raise their population, and then you have what's called a reintroduction program, where you slowly start bringing those organisms back into the wild. And then once you do that, then the population in the wild takes off, and that helps to restore those organisms in that environment. It's a very slow process, but it is an important process. All right, so that's it for today's lesson. There's a Google form on this. Make sure it gets done, and I will see you all tomorrow.